Folks, comics. They've been around the block, from surprisingly epic highs to very avoidable lows, like criminally avoidable lows, to be honest. Each medium has its own unique talents and limitations. Music utilizes everything around sound, from beats per minute to rhythm to brainstem energy. I don't fucking know. Honestly, I know nothing about music. Music is just like this magical thing that just happens, in my opinion. Meanwhile, movies and TV utilize narrative structure, visualization, and audio to their advantage to tell compelling stories that relate to the personal viewer. Comics, however, have a different type of limitation. Sure, they can visually tell a story and convey narrative in visual ways, but they can't show movement in the same way. They can't have audio in the same way. And unlike novels, which have a prose where they can just take time to describe things, they also don't have that to their advantage. And yet, despite these restrictions, the good old boys of comics get it done. And by boys, I also mean girls and non-binaries. I think anyone can make comics. Please. I'm just a guy. Comics began answering this question from their inception, but since have become more complex as they grow upon each other and learn from their own history. Where once it was the norm and routine to use narrative boxes and speech bubbles and thought bubbles to convey emotion directly to the reader, now a lot of comics can use silent panels to convey the same amount of emotion with less wordage. On top of that, creators were influenced by each other and began to learn from their predecessors, creating a more complex webbing of what could be done in the medium as more cooks entered the kitchen. Carrying this analogy to its natural conclusion, does this mean that like being woke in this kitchen alternate universe where kitchen is comics, that putting too much spice in it would be like woke? Like all the chefs are around the soup putting salt in, and one guy comes in and is like, hey, what about paprika? And they're just like, and when they have like a kitchen gate instead of a comics gate. So comics have been able to form themselves into this voice that feels complex and entirely its own. And yet people since the dawn of time have been asking and begging for comics to be adapted into fucking live action movies. People get on their hands and knees to beg some guy named Chris to play their favorite superhero. I don't get where this obsession came from, and don't get me wrong, I like superhero movies, I like comic book based movies, and I think a lot of the adaptations have been good. But the reason I like comics is because I like comics. It's not just about the story, it's about the format. So taking the comic story and removing the comic aspect of it is not really interesting to me. And so executives in Hollywood hear this cry for action and go, yeah, we'll give it to you just for the money wise. And then they produce this $200 million shit fest, and everyone's just like, what went wrong? Hey guys, I could tell you free of charge why it went wrong. Because the comic worked because it was a comic. The people who made the comic were excited to make a comic, and the comic made a comic, the comic. Because most of the times, Mark Miller exception, when people go to make a comic, they're not going in the mindset of like, oh, this is gonna get adapted. Most of them are going to say, hey, I like making comics, I want to tell this story through a comic lens, so I'm gonna make a comic. It's like trying to turn a steak into a cake. Like, yeah, you could probably do it, but now this cake tastes funny and Gordon Ramsay's calling me a dumbass off screen. So that's what this video is going to be about. It's about the unadaptability in comics, and we're going to explore that through 5 comics that I think are unadaptable. If I don't say anything, I can't cut myself off, so I'm just going to sit here in silence for a little bit. It's actually kind of boring just... The Nightly News is actually a book I never read until I was pitching this video to some friends, and a few of them were like, you gotta read the Jonathan Hickman book, and I was like, I get it, you guys love Hickman, it's not that big of a deal, I don't have to read every Hickman book. And they're like, no Evan, you gotta read this Jonathan Hickman book. So I read the Jonathan Hickman book. The Nightly News is a 6-issue series that came out in 2006, all by Jonathan Hickman. And you could tell it came out in 2006 because the first page hits you with the R word. But even this early on to Hickman's career has all of your favorite Hickmanisms. Nihilism, dialogue that sounds like robots trying to pass a Turing test, and motherfucking data pages! A common thread you're going to find in this video is that every writer is effective here because they have a distinct voice. Now when we, royally, say voice, what we're talking about isn't like an actual thing you can hear, but a voice in a comic is something that the writer or creators put into the book that's distinctly them. It could be themes explored, their actual dialogue being written, the presentation, format, something that when you read it, you pick it up and go, oh yeah, this is a Jonathan Hickman comic. And honestly, we could go into like a 3-hour deep dive into what makes a Jonathan Hickman book a Jonathan Hickman book, but we're going to focus on nightly news, and in this case, what makes this comic unadaptable is its presentation. Nightly news is about propaganda and our position and relationship to it that makes us fit into this corporal-centric America. It's a work of fiction crafted from a place of reality that bends the line between truth and lies in its own narrative. We're constantly being lied to, but presented to it as facts. There's a lot of moments in this book that's going to frustrate you, scare you, and make you go, really? And that's kind of the point. It's supposed to make it so that you read this book and look outside your window and go, uh-oh. And what makes this work so well is the presentation. The presentation is key here because it breaks a lot of the traditions of a classic comic format. There's not a lot of paneling in the same way that you would see very grid systems and gutters in most comics. There's a lot of statistics thrown at you. There's infographics and graphs and data pages and little snippets of information in little subtextual ways. The presentation reminds me a lot of reading like a data page. Go figure. Reminds me of reading a data page from a specification sheet or from a presentation in a business meeting. There's a lot of statistics thrown at you that show numbers going up and numbers going down and this and that. And it's all related to the story, but it's also a little bit skippable, which makes it even more realistic that people read this comic and kind of go like, yeah, whatever, give me to the story. And the comic itself addresses that directly. And even if you haven't worked a corporate job, the presentation is going to feel familiar to you. It's like reading a magazine or seeing news on the news. And it's all because Hickman comes from a background in marketing. He knows what marketing's like. He knows how to present these things to people. He's a designer. He's a craftsman, to be honest. And what makes it even scarier is that he's talking about his own job. He's talking about marketing. He's talking about the news, and he's talking about how evil it is. So you have someone from the inside presenting to you how the news would normally present to you, but flipping the news on itself. It's a format that kind of only works for this because these are the same tools that corporate fascism uses to educate us, and Hickman uses it against them in this comic. Or does he? Because when you read the comic, it's kind of hard to say what side Hickman is on, and really kind of what side the protagonists are on. Are they the good guys or bad guys? Does Hickman believe in what he's writing or not? He says he does it, but then also like the stuff he's writing is like pretty specific. And also the protagonists aren't totally wrong in what they're saying, but then also they're kind of wrong in what they're doing. So where does Hickman lie in this line? But more importantly, where do you lie in this line? You're being presented a story that tells you truths and lies in a way that makes you lean towards believing it. I mean, look at it. It has statistics. Why would it be lying to us? I mean, look at all the numbers and percentage sides. Yeah, I didn't read it per se, but also like, look at it. It has to be telling the truth about something, right? That's how you really feel reading the book. And it's something that can only be done in comics because the format is so specific to a magazine or infographic nature. You need that visualization, you need that breakdown of format, and you need that directness. Attaboy is a comic like you've never seen it, and every time I return to it, I just smile so widely across my face. Attaboy follows a Mega Man / Astro Boy-like video game protagonist trying to beat a game. Except, that's not true. It's actually about someone playing a video game called Attaboy. Except, that's not true either. Here's what I can tell you. Attaboy is a comic presented in the form of a video game instruction manual. In it you'll find pages showing the various villains you might face in the game, maps, story beats, and essentially a walkthrough of the larger ideas of the game. But on top of that, it isn't even the actual video game instruction manual. This is a story about a man recounting a game that he remembers that no one else seems to have heard of. This comic is an attempt to recreate that video game instruction manual. Why? Well, I actually don't know. Now, is this a game the author Tony, can I call you Tony? Now, is this a game that Tony actually remembers playing that no one ever heard of? The answer? Who cares? The story isn't in the truth. The story is the truth. The emotions you feel, the lessons you might learn, the reassessing of your own past and desires. These are the things that Tony, we're on a first name basis now, was able to explore vividly through flow, art, and dialogue. There's something about the flow of comics that really has to be nailed down through the lettering and action, and I think this book does that really well. There's a lot of flowing moments where you're just kind of following the action as it goes through. Sometimes it's a DeLuca effect, but a lot of times it is just from panel to panel. Just a natural flow is just done really well by Tony in this. But that flow isn't even the thing that makes it unadaptable. This book is a video game instruction manual come to life. The format was chosen specifically as an avenue to connect the reader to a nostalgic feeling. A lot of us has played video games, a lot of us have read through instruction manuals and have looked through them vividly to be like, how do I get through this? How do I get through this? How do I get through this? It's the instruction manual on how to get to a video game, and he relates this on an instruction manual of how this protagonist is trying to get through his own life. There is a connection we have to nostalgia, which is why it's so commercialized. But Tony uses this masterfully for self-reflection. I'm not gonna say this subject matter is or isn't real or true, but it's real and true to the story, right? And that's really what matters, I think, to me. The protagonist is reflecting and is remembering, and he is connected to this Attaboy character and remembering how hard it was to get through these portions of his life. And there's really just no better way you could have told this story, and adapting it would just give it no flavor. Okay, yep, here it is, Watchmen. You know it, I know it. If you don't know it, here's a quick rundown of it. Watchmen's actually about a bunch of cool people doing cool stuff, and nothing goes wrong, and nobody's a fascist in it. Not a single person is experiencing or doing fascism to anybody. Now, I will admit, I'm a fan of the movie, and I like the show enough. Was the movie good? No, not really. But I enjoyed it to an extent. The costume design was really great, visually it was very appealing, but I think what really made it fall off for me is that it did not understand the point of the story. The movie clearly glorified violence in a way that I think the comic just totally did not do. When you read the comic, yeah, there's bad and gruesome violence in it, but it feels bad and gruesome. It doesn't feel kick-ass or cool. The whole time you read it, every time there's a violence on the page, you kind of like grimace or like step back a little bit from it. But in the movie, I'm like, hell yeah, sick flips, dude. And this isn't a Zack Snyder snub or anything. Like, a lot of people misunderstand Watchmen. Like, how many people do you know idolize Rorschach as some cool, aloof hero, when in reality he's like a smelly racist who eats cold beans from a can? A lot of people think that Alan Moore was trying to say that superheroes are just inherently lame and stupid and bad, when in reality he's trying to say that the direction that superhero comics are taking is dangerous. Superheroes always had a hand in propaganda. Like, Captain America was a superhero created specifically to get people to enlist more into the war efforts. But if you look back at like Superman, for instance, that's a character that was designed to fight for the working man, for the people. But Moore was seeing that comics were pushing more and more in towards fascist thinking. Superheroes were becoming more of an extension of imperialism than they were becoming a working man's hero. And that's a conversation that Watchmen's directly having with the entire industry and its readers, and that's one of the reasons I think it's unadaptable. Let's take movies for example. If you were to take Watchmen into a movie, you'd have to change what it's trying to have a conversation about. You can't have the same direct conversation with comic books because you're no longer in a comic book medium. You can't be a movie saying like, oh, comic books are doing this funny, and here's how we're reflecting that in this movie. If Watchmen was to successfully become a movie, it would have to look at other superhero movies and say, hey, here's how they're doing this, here's how they're presenting this, and here's why it's wrong. Which is not what these movies or TV shows or adaptations in any way have been trying to do. They've all been trying to be like, we're very faithful to the original, look at us, we're adapting one for one. And you just can't do that because the format is made specifically for comics. The famous 9-grid paneling of Watchmen isn't something original to Watchmen, it's something that Watchmen looked at and said, oh, this is something that every format's using. How do we utilize this to have a wider conversation? And that's just something that's inherently lost when you switch it to a medium. It doesn't matter if it's animated, it doesn't matter if it's movies, it doesn't matter if it's live action or a podcast. It's lost immediately because the format changed. Another thing that's hard to adapt about this one is the historical context around it. This was written in the middle of the Red Scare, and at the same time America was slowly moving already towards a fascist society. Policing was up, imprisonment was up, Brother Eye was already here. So for any adaptation of Watchmen, they'd have to look at that and say, has that changed? And if so, how has that changed? How do we reflect that in that story? Do we want to continue to make this story a time period piece, or do we reflect our modern society into this new adaptation? And this is a conversation that every movie adaptation ever has to have if they're going to directly reflect what was said one for one as much as they can, or if they're going to modernize it in some way. And I think a lot of times modernization is the answer. If they are going to attempt to adapt Watchmen, which again, I don't think they should, the course of action I think that's best for it is to try to modernly make it relevant. Even if you set it in the same time period that the story originally takes place in, how do you reflect current feelings into this new movie? Because what's the point of adaptation if you're not going to add anything new to it? Seeing something one for one is uninteresting to me. And throughout all the adaptations, the one-to-ones are the ones that fumbled the hardest. The TV show got a lot more praise and love because it tried to be more relevant to the modern era. And there's something to that. Next up, we have the first book from the Black Orchard mythos, The Passageway. Horror is a genre with many possibilities, endless possibilities, because horror is always changing. Yeah, the root of things are always going to be about the same, but you never know what you're going to discover as a new fear for yourself. A few years ago, I discovered that I was terrified of spelunking. How I figured that out? I was on YouTube one day and a spelunking video came up and I almost threw up. I was so terrified. Look up Nutty Putty Cave and you'll know what I'm talking about. Silly name, very serious consequences. And now I'm discovering that I'm not nearly as afraid of a nuclear holocaust as I thought I'd be. If anything, it's kind of embarrassing now to think that we might die because some loser is so obsessed with getting attention of Reddit Nazis that he paid millions of dollars to have someone grind his Pathfinder accounts. Remember to the good old days of fashion that were sneaky and subtle and not puppeteered by a guy who looks like he put a Frosty the Snowman hat on a Michael Myers corpse. All that to say, horror is most effective when you speak to the soul. And when you speak to the soul, you speak to society. And to change society is to change the soul. To change the soul is to change society. The Black Orchard mythos is an anthology series that attempts to touch your soul through horror. Each story is set in the same universe but is completely standalone, and the first one is called The Passageway. We follow geologists who's sent to a lighthouse to investigate a strange phenomenon that's happening involving a weird, suddenly appearing hole. Unlike your mom. Now, horror isn't a specific genre to comics, but I would argue that no one does it like comics because of choice. Movies and TV shows make you passive observers. You're watching something, you could close your eyes, you could turn away, you could take breaks and walk out while the movie continues on its own. But for comics and novels, you have to make the active choice to continue to flip the page. Sure, you're passive to the story still, but you're no longer passive to the experience. You're an active engager in this experience. You can't sit back and say like, oh, well, it's out of my hands, I'm not looking. You have to look, you have to turn the page, and it's your choice entirely. I think that's so interesting. And I'll be honest, I've been jump scared by novels before, but not in the same way that I've been jump scared by comics. In The Passageway, there's a scene where the protagonist sends a drone down this mysterious and spooky hole that maybe is endless, and it's a very foreboding scene. It's not a scene that you're kind of like, boop, 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 waiting for something to like jump out at you. But in these 2 pages, there's so much motion happening. It makes it feel like you're being dragged along more than being pushed forward. And it doesn't feel like something spooky or really scary is about to happen, though you do realize that there is some type of revelation that's going to happen soon. So when you go to flip that page, you're not expecting to see this. Yeah! And here's the worst part, you chose to do that. The story made you feel safe and secure that you can just freely flip to the next page with no consequences, and you did, and now you have to live with the consequences of your actions. And what's worse, this is not the middle of the story. This is towards the beginning. You have to continue flipping pages after this moment. There's a special feeling of betrayal in jump scaring yourself, essentially, and in having to choose to continue this book if you want to see the full story. And at this point, you probably are engaged with the story and want to see it through. This is a pacing and framing trick that can only be done in comics because you are the pilot. And last but certainly not least is the humorous, the incredible, the striking, the unbelievable Gwenpool. Now, Scourge, I know what you're thinking. Hold the phone, Evan. Isn't this just a cash grab from Marvel to capitalize in the early 2010s on the popularity of both Deadpool and Gwen Stacy and the rise of Spider-Gwen? Wrong! Wrong. I mean, yeah, true, but also wrong. Gwenpool was first conceptualized by Chris Bachalo as a variant cover for a Deadpool comic. At the time, Marvel was doing this Gwen Stacy variant cover marketing scheme to increase their profits. So in conception, it was what if Gwen Stacy was Wade Wilson was Deadpool? But once this variant cover was released, cosplayers loved it and were cosplaying it all over the place. Marvel saw this and said, hey, they love this as a hobby, but we love this as a money, so we gotta money this. And so they did. So they're looking at ways to like bring this to life, and allegedly and probably truly, they said, hey, we can do this, but Gwenpool can't be either Gwen Stacy nor Deadpool because we don't own the movie or TV rights to either of those characters anymore. We want everyone to be able to be adaptable in the future. So they brought on Christopher Hastings as writer and editor Heather Antos. And what Christopher Hastings brought to the table was, all right, here's an idea. What if Gwendolyn Poole was this character who was not originally from this mainline universe? What if she's from a universe just like ours, boring and plain, but she finds herself in the 616 universe? And that's what the story ends up being being about. Gwenpool ends up in this universe, and at first we don't know exactly how or really where she's from, but she has this outside information as if she is a reader of the comics. She knows the secret identity of the characters, she knows the history of these characters and how to defeat them, even when no one else should know their flaws or weaknesses. And she uses this kind of for evil. She becomes a mercenary and then a lackey of MODOK. And the first half of this story is kind of just that, a silly romp of a character running around doing mercenary jobs for her evil boss. And that's relatable in and of itself, but the story really changes drastically halfway through. Because halfway through, she realizes she has superpowers of her own. She learns how to break the fourth wall in a way that we've only seen since Grant Morrison's Animal Man. So it switches from being this story about a carefree mercenary who doesn't see any consequences in her actions, though it does continue to be that, but its main story becomes this retrospective or criticism of the comic industry as it is. There's commentary on what it means to be a C-list character, a character always on the sideline, always on the constant verge of flailing into obscurity, never getting a chance to say anything meaningful or relevant. It uses this relationship with the history of C-list characters to relate to Gwendolyn Poole as a character before she became the Gwenpool we know. In her own universe, which again was just like ours, she was kind of a loser. She was an 18-ish girl who was going nowhere with her life, who had no idea of what she really wanted to do. She really didn't have any real ambitions. All she had were comics to escape into. And so what she do? Escape into comics. Finally, she found a world where she belongs, where she's this combination idea of two different popular characters. What could possibly go wrong? And yet, even in this world, she's not the A-list celebrity she's expecting to be. She expects that with her knowledge and lore, she finally has a place where she can utilize these informations to skyrocket into fandom. But instead, she still lands in being this like C to B list character, even in her own narrative. And I think that's something that's really relatable. That each time that I read this comic was in a time period where I needed to read this comic. And it's because Gwenpool, as a character, even outside of relationship to comics, is relatable to me as a reader. Her story is reflective of a lot of people's feelings of maybe having a desire to be ambitious or desire to do something, but dwindling and flailing around, really not sure which way the wave's gonna take you, but allowing the wave to take you anyway. Gwen is a character looking for control in her life and finally finding it and still not having it. And that's probably an adaptable portion of the comic, though I do think you do lose something by translating this character to any other medium, because there is a relationship between her as a comic character who reads comics and us as a reader of comics who's reading comics. But it also comes down to Gurihiru's visualization and usage of the medium to tell this story. Because her set of powers allow her to break the fourth wall in a more extraordinary way than just saying like, I know what's gonna happen because I know tropes and I know what the history of these characters is. She's able to step out of the panel. She's able to do things that we haven't seen in comics in a long time. She can literally erase borders to combine panels. She can drop a pencil from one panel to another one. At one point she drops my boy Pastebot Piece into obscurity off panel. Like literally drops him out of a panel into this white void. What the fuck? Like, I know I was just saying how scared I am of spelunking, but I can't imagine anything more terrifying than just drifting in nothingness. Never mind, spelunking is actually worse than that. I'd rather be on fire, drowning, anything but spelunking. Spelunking sounds like the fucking worst. And all this is an attempt on both the creators and the characters to not get canceled, essentially. Because at the time, the book was slipping and rating. I think it was always kind of the idea to have this narrative and contextualization around the history of comics and the format itself, but there is a lot of narrative that is relevant because sales were slipping at the time. This is a book that editors were looking at saying like, we were expecting this to sell great, so why is it not, and should we even keep this around at this point? So now you have this dual narrative of the creators fighting for the life of this book while the characters also fighting for the life of this book, and you see it as the art begins to take off in more and more unique ways. It's trying to find a way for you to latch on to this both visually and narratively, and I think it succeeded, and it's a damn shame that it still got canceled. The Unbelievable Gwenpool lasted 25 issues, and I think it's a perfect amount for the story, even though I think 50 issues would have been even better. But what this book gives us is a beginning, middle, and end that both on purpose and accidentally shows the trajectory of superhero comics. The story starts as a comic that's safe in its narrative and that's just trying to have a good time and tell us a story about a relatable enough character. And then in the middle part, it starts to say, oh shit, we need to shake something up in order to keep ourselves relevant and people reading. And by the end, it's sadly saying goodbye, even though it doesn't want to just yet. Gwen is terrified of going back to obscurity, the book's canceling. What does that mean for a character like her, who was made as a marketing gimmick, who now has to find a way to stay relevant and go forward? The likelihood was that she was just gonna disappear, like so many other different characters like her. And again, I think that fear is so relatable to us. We're all kind of afraid of just going into nothingness and being left behind. And I think that connection between the character, us, the comic, and comic history is something that's just unadaptable. You really just can't relay the same framing in the same way that makes it relatable to all of us at the same time. I'm sure that you could find a way to show panels on a TV screen or a movie screen, but it's just not going to have the same connection to us. And so that makes Gwenpool unadaptable, and I think it's for the best that she stays where she is and hopefully finds some success in her new series. So those are the 5 comics that I find unadaptable. Again, I do think comics as a whole don't need to be adapted. Is it okay for them to get adapted? Absolutely. Invincible is a fun show despite having a lot of flaws because of its corporate upbringing. And the comic industry also has a lot of issues. I'm not here to say that comics are untouchable in that regard, but comics are being written to be comics for a reason, and they work because they are comics. To take away one aspect of something is to take away the heart of something. When you're adapting these things, especially without giving credit, you are taking away from the hard work. You are taken away from the hard work put in by the artist, writer, letterer, colorer, and editor. And it's just the bottom of the barrel. There's so many more comics that I think are unadaptable. And I'm sure there's some that you think are unadaptable. If you think there's a comic out there that's just completely unadaptable, leave it in the comments, let us know, and we'll debate that down there. But in the meantime, thank you for watching. I had a great time. I hope you did too, and I'll catch you next time. But before you go, I'm not gonna tell you to like and subscribe, but if you wouldn't mind, please consider it. Perchance. Maybe. All right, bye.